Welcome, everybody, to the Thoughtful Bro, live streaming on a Mighty Blaze, as usual, every Tuesday at 2. We're here to talk about, as always, what makes great books tick and what makes great authors tick. We're also here because we do try to talk about books that really matter and books that can change people's lives. And the guest we have on today and the book we're going to be talking about certainly fits that description. A few words from me before we get started. A Mighty Blaze is an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers virtually during COVID and beyond, even as COVID ends. You can find scores of our interviews. We literally do 6 to 10 new interviews every single week. You can find them on our Facebook page or our YouTube page. If we're at Mighty Blaze, we're not asking anybody for any money. Again, it's an all-volunteer organization. If you want to support us or show the love a little bit, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. So if you're new, do give us a like or a follow. It really helps. You can also support us by subscribing to our weekly podcast, of course, which is free. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter by going to amightyblaze.com. Then every Sunday, you'll get an email saying who the guests are that we have coming up. As I said, again, it's all 100% free, done by volunteers. And if you do just have the urge to pull out your wallet and spend a little money, please spend it on the fabulous books and authors that we bring on the shows. For example, James Carroll, who wrote a gripping, heart-wrenching new book that we're about to talk about called The Truth at the Heart of the Lie. We'll have audience questions at the end. You can post them in the comments. They'll make their way to me. And then a quick tease about next week. We're going to have on author Pete Davis. Pete's Harvard Law School graduation speech called A Counterculture of Commitment has been viewed more than 30 million times. He wrote a book based on that talk called Dedicated, which is about how to escape what he calls the infinite browsing mode of our restless, indecisive modern lives, and how to really dedicate ourselves to a few things in life that matter. So that's next week. I'll be on with Pete Davis right here at 2. But on to this week. Author James Carroll is the author of 12 novels and 9 works of nonfiction. His book, An American Requiem, won the National Book Award for nonfiction. His New York Times bestselling Constantine's Sword is now an acclaimed documentary. His op-ed appeared weekly in the Boston Globe for 23 years, and he continues to write for The New Yorker and The Atlantic. He's a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and lives in Boston with his wife, the writer Alexandra Marshall. In 2019, James wrote a cover article for The Atlantic, which caused something of a small sensation. It was about dismantling the priesthood in the Catholic Church and returning the church to the people, as James says. James has carried that argument further in his new memoir, The Truth at the Heart of the Lie: How the Catholic Church Lost Its Soul. The book has been praised for its historical richness, the intellectual breadth, and, as I mentioned, the heart-wrenching spiritual struggle at its center, which is really just grippingly and poetically rendered. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Stephen Greenblatt said that with this book, James Carroll takes us to the heart of one of the great crises of our times. James Carroll, welcome to the Thoughtful Bro. Oh, James, I think you're on mute.
Let me...
there you go. I can hear you now.
Well, let's hope that's the last technical glitch we have, shall we? I'm glad to be with you, Mark. Thanks so much for welcoming me. I look forward to this.
Great to have you. Great to have you. It's really an honor. And I do have kind of more than the usual amount of questions, so I do really want to get to it. The book is terrific. I just finished it this morning. But why don't you just describe for our audience the book in your own words? I mean, what is this book about? And specifically, what is the truth at the heart of the lie?
Well, I'm pausing because it's a complicated invitation you put in front of me to say in a few words what this book is, but I'll try. 3 things. Number 1, it's a response to the grotesque, outrageous, criminal failures of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. I am a lifelong Catholic, and my crushed heart and my angry soul finally overflowed a couple of years ago in response to the refusal of the Catholic bishops to deal with, in any significant way, what has been laid bare by the rape predators among the Catholic priesthood and the outrageous cover-up system that the bishops continue to defend. And so the book is a polemical attack on that failure in the church. It's also a look back at the history and theology of the Catholic Church to try to understand where does this failure come from. And they go all the way back to the way in which Catholics, Christians, began to misread the story of Adam and Eve. How's that for the beginning? You know, the way in which the book of Genesis was horribly reinterpreted in Catholic history, basically to scapegoat Eve, the woman, for the sin of Adam, and therefore for all suffering, death, misery that followed the sin of Adam, as the Christian story is told. That was a catastrophe, a mistaken theology, sponsored by the greatest theologians in the history of the church, and basically still underwriting Catholic attitudes, for example, toward women, and why the unjust exclusion of women from the priesthood, to take the most blatant example, but also Catholic attitudes toward reproduction, women's rights.
James, if I could interrupt for a second, it seems like your microphone just got a little bit covered up.
Oh, okay.
It's perfect. The sound is perfect again. So just keep going.
I had promised only one technical glitch. Now that's two. Here's hoping that's it. And so a polemic against the abuse structure of the church, a history of theology that tries to understand where this comes from. And finally, the book is a personal memoir, because I couldn't tell these larger stories in the abstract. I had to tell them how they affected one particular believer, myself, a boy raised in an Irish Catholic family, ultimately becoming a Catholic priest myself. I was a priest for 5 short years, decades ago, but I've been a lifelong Catholic, a dissenting Catholic, all these years. And I tell that story too. My love of the church, but my fierce determination to challenge the corruptions of the church. The truth at the heart of the lie, Mark, the reason I'm still a Catholic is because the Catholic Church has put me in touch with Jesus Christ, who preferred service over power and gave me the example I've been trying to live up to all these years. Jesus is the truth at the heart of the lie, which is the structure of the church.
Thank you, James. And as I mentioned earlier, this book is an expansion, really, of this article you wrote for The Atlantic called "To Save the Church, Dismantle the Priesthood." We're going to get into a lot of the details of what you mean by that as the interview goes on. But just to start, can you tell me how the ideas have matured and evolved based on some of the feedback that you got from that article? How are your ideas different now than when that article was published a couple years ago?
Well, let me just step back quickly and say, when the Boston Globe Spotlight team laid bare the grotesque secrets of priests abusing children in Boston in the early 2000s, which became that hit movie Spotlight.
Right.
And by the way, I was not part of the Spotlight team, but I was a Boston Globe columnist at the time. And that whole enterprise generated a lot of my own work. When that first broke, people thought, well, that priests abusing children is a Boston problem, because Boston Irish Catholics are neurotic, let's face it. They've had this contest with Boston Brahmin, the WASP establishment. They feel inferior. They came here in droves during the Irish famine. They've never gotten over their inferiority complex. These really kind of grotesque caricatures of who Catholics in Boston are. It's a Boston problem.
Yeah.
No. Wait a minute. Very quickly, within months, stories of priests abusing children elsewhere in the United States began to surface. And in Europe, Italy, Rome, Ireland, Germany, they said, well, it's an American problem. American Catholics have this inferiority complex in relationship to the Protestant establishment. Therefore, this neurosis has infected priests and blah, 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 like that.
Right.
Boom,
Right.
very quickly, Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, wherever there were priests, there were children being abused, and there were bishops protecting the predators instead of the children. And that progression showed that there was something deep in the DNA of Roman Catholicism that was the problem.
Right.
And there was a lot of denial. There's a habit of denial about this. And the biggest denial, in my opinion, and what I finally came to myself, was the denial that the structure of the priesthood itself is the source of the problem. What's called clericalism, the idea that the priest is above other people, separate from other people, not accountable to other people. If a priest abuses a child, he's not to be held accountable the way other people are held accountable when they abuse a child. The bishops protect him. Why do they do that? Because they all live on the same structure of Catholic power.
Right.
Bishops, priests, the cardinals, the pope at the top. That structure has to be protected at all costs. That structure is clericalism. Priests protecting each other instead of children, not because they don't care about the children. It's that they care more about protecting their own place on the power structure of the church. When I wrote the article in the Atlantic Monthly, I was calling for the dismantling of that structure.
Right.
And the short of it is, you dismantle that structure by dismantling the priesthood, getting rid of these malicious and malevolent ideas that the priest is better than other people. The priest is to be held apart from and above other people. And the priest can't be called to account for his misbehavior. Women being brought into the ministry of the church, lay people given real power in the church. These are the solutions. The democracy of the church is the issue. Now, when I published that article, the people who were most offended by it, ironically enough, many priests, are those liberals who would agree with me about the outrages of priests abusing children. They would cling to the idea, and they did in response to what I wrote, that it's what you could call the few bad apples theory. Right. You see the same thing going on now when America is trying to reckon with what's wrong with policing, and how is it that policing has become so allied with white supremacy in this country. And the defenders of the essential status quo of our jurisprudence system want to say that George Floyd is murdered by 1, 2, 3, or 4 bad apples, not by a policing structure that has been abusing African Americans since the days of slavery. Mm-hmm. This is an equivalent act of denial. A few bad apples. The priesthood itself isn't the problem. So get rid of those bad apples and everything will be fine. And that's basically what I was told in response to my call for a vast reorganization of the church.
I want to get to that later in the interview about like what is it about the specific DNA of the Catholic Church that makes it so difficult to make these kinds of changes that you want. But I also I want to just go back and kind of in your story and talk about like what was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I just want to read like a brief passage from the book, just a couple of sentences to give people the idea of the raw and really poetic power of this book. You write of the church today, quote, ethically speaking, the Catholic Church has collapsed into an ocean of ruin. If concrete blocks had been chained to our limbs, we Catholics could not have been plunged more efficiently into the bottom of a moral abyss. Doesn't get much more stark than that. You go on to say that the church has disqualified itself as a major center of moral value, which it had been for 2,000 years. And I guess my question, you bring up the Spotlight team, and I mean, those stories broke in the early 2000s. And, you know, I think the straw that broke the camel's back for you wasn't until many, many years later. And I guess the question is, can you just describe, you know, what did break the back, and why did it take so many years for this something so decisive to happen within you?
Well, it's important to remember what we're talking about. We're talking about thousands and thousands of children being sexually assaulted, raped by priests. Now, that's so abhorrent a fact that we don't hold on to it. It's slippery. It gets away from us. If we allow ourselves to feel that, to really feel it, we have to respond with power to it. For me, the years after the Spotlight revelations, I continued to write about it in my Boston Globe column. And I continued to care about it, and I continued to feel strongly about it. But I always maintained a conviction that this is so grotesque, the church is bound to be reckoning with it in a responsible way. And that conviction was really brought to the fore of my hope when Pope Francis was elected Pope 8 years ago, out of nowhere, responding to, coming after a reactionary Pope, Benedict XVI, who himself came after a reactionary Pope, John Paul II. Suddenly we have a Pope of real reform, of real moral imagination, a man whose clear goodness captured the attention of the world. Francis is a very special person. And as a Catholic, I recognized the leader I'd been waiting for my whole adult life. So I really began to think, now the church will reckon with this problem. Pope Francis has done a lot of major and important things. He's become an advocate for migrants. He's an opponent of fascist impulses that cloak themselves as populism. He's a defender of the European idea. He's a prophet on the question of climate change. He's absolutely the world's most important voice on inequality, speaking up for the poor in ways that no one else really is. All of that takes second place to what was his most important responsibility, which was to deal with this scandalous criminal lie at the heart of Catholic life. And he hasn't done it. Mark, that's what sent me into this new stage of my life as a Catholic, embodied in this book, but also embodied in the way I live now. I don't go to Mass anymore. I can't present myself to the altar. Not that I hold every priest responsible for this morass, many, many good priests on whom I've depended over the years, but I can no longer be a Catholic as usual. And it's because Pope Francis, his goodness, when I saw that he too was in the grip of this clericalism, he too is defending priests instead of putting victims first, even Francis, that's when I saw something in a completely new way. In the book, I call it a snap.
Right.
And there's the revelation. Francis is as good as they come.
Right.
And what was his response to the priest abuse crisis? He gathered bishops in Rome and handed over to the bishops the responsibility to deal with it. Hello. In the book, I say, this is like putting mafia chieftains in charge of the crime commission. The bishops have disqualified themselves on this question by 20 years, 30 years of protecting the predators. Bishops and priests supervising bishops and priests. No lay oversight, no clear structures of accountability, no defined penalties for abuse or cover-up, no real change in the basic sources of this problem, which are male supremacy embodied in the refusal to ordain women to the priesthood, the sexual neurosis of the church embodied in the requirement that all priests be celibate, theoretically asexual, which we know many, if not most, are not. And finally, a notion of who God is, a doom-laden theology that believes that we need the ministrations of a priest in order to be worthy of going to heaven.
Right.
That theology is a key to the way in which Catholic people have been forced to submit to the priesthood. So 3 pillars: male supremacy, sexual neurosis, and a grotesque theology of a doom-inflicting God. And Pope Francis has done nothing. Well, I take it back. He has done something on the third of those 3, because Francis has emphasized again and again that mercy, as he puts it, is the calling card of God, the merciful God that Francis represents. But he hasn't done anything to dismantle the other 2 structures of this crime: sexual neurosis embodied in the celibate priest, male supremacy embodied in the refusal to ordain women.
And on that note, I mean, I thought one of the most striking things in the book, and I've heard you say this in interviews, is you point out that if a woman tries to say a Catholic mass, she will be excommunicated. But if a priest abuses a minor, there is no punishment. Is that correct?
No mandated punishment.
Right.
A woman saying mass is, in the act, excommunicated from the church. Boom.
Yep.
There are no canonical procedures that are in play when a priest abuses a child. The priest is to be judged and adjudicated by fellow priests and bishops who, time after time, protect the priest instead of the child.
Right. James, tell us where this scandal is right now. And I'll just tell you, as somebody who is what you'd probably call a lapsed Catholic, I followed this story with just enormous horror and disgust when it first broke. I saw the movie, of course, but it does seem to have faded. Certainly the last 4 years have been very tumultuous. It seems to have faded from kind of the consciousness of the global discussion in some way. But just tell us now, like, to the extent that you know, where is this scandal? There were tens of thousands of victims in Ireland, in the United States, so many other countries. But for example, could you say that you feel like, you know, there has been some punishment to some people, even if it's not satisfactory? Do we feel like because of all this bad publicity, this scandal is receding? Or are minors being abused at just the rate they were 20 years ago?
Well, I couldn't say that. I don't know that.
Right.
It would be surprising if minors were being abused at same rates, because people are aware of the issue now. For one thing, parents don't trust their children with priests in the way they used to. Priests are not figures of trust and reliability in the way they once were. So I'm sure the situation is different, but what's not different is the way in which the hierarchy of the Catholic Church is responding to the question. So there is still a protection of abusers. And let's open up the problem a little further, because the priesthood does engage priests in various other kinds of inhuman and criminal behavior. Not just children are abused, women are abused, young men are abused, young adult men are abused by bishops, seminarians, being pressed into, you know, the only year before last, Cardinal McCarrick, one of the most important figures in the Roman Catholic Church in the world, was brought to a tribunal in the Vatican, forced by the work of journalists to reckon with Cardinal McCarrick, and he was found guilty of abusing young seminarians and of various other forms of malfeasance. You asked, where is this? I think that we human beings find it difficult to maintain a certain level of attention to the truly grotesque and the truly frightening. Another example from the completely secular world is in the United States of America right now, in May, we have a far less intense grip on the meaning of the events of January 6th than we did in January.
Yeah.
We knew, even people across the political spectrum knew, right to left, blue state, red state, people knew in January that we were on the edge of chaos in this country, an insurrection that could well have killed the Speaker of the House, killed the Vice President of the United States. We knew how close we were to something truly momentous, dangerous. Hello, where is that sense of urgency? Some people still have it. I frankly have it. I'm obsessed with it.
Yeah.
But by and large, we've kind of slipped back into the old habits of a very divided political culture. We can't have that anxiety foremost in mind. With the Catholic Church, we've really let the anger and the worry and the outrage of the corruptions of the priesthood slip back to the back burner on the top of the stove, if you will. It won't stay there. I promise you. It won't stay there. We're waiting for the next scandal. We're waiting for the next bishop, the next cardinal, the next grotesque betrayal. And people will once again come to it because it hasn't gone away.
Right.
It's a little bit like white supremacy. We will be confronted with the meaning of white supremacy when an African-American man is murdered on the street with people as witnesses to it.
Yeah.
But then, even when the Chauvin trial is underway, African-American men continue to be murdered by police. 1, 2, 3, one only a few miles away from that courtroom in Minneapolis.
Right.
And yet how did that register with us? And in what way are we sliding back into business as usual? I said before, I don't go to mass anymore. That's my own personal commitment to refuse to slip back into business as usual. I love the mass, Mark. It's been a center of my own identity for my whole life. I'm a believing Catholic still, but I'm not practicing because I refuse to be complacent about this problem.
Yeah.
The lovely winning figure of Pope Francis invites a kind of complacency.
Yeah.
And when he told us that he has resolved this question with that meeting of bishops, the mafia chieftains, we, speaking generally, believed him.
Yeah. So let's talk about the church and kind of what is it about the church and what makes it so difficult for Pope Francis. So I just want to just give a little bit of a kind of some facts that you lay out about the church, which are just a good reminder, just as a refresher. So the Catholic Church is the oldest institution in the world. It is the largest non-governmental institution in the world. And you say you quite eloquently and quite fairly point out in the book the kind of imponderable good the church does in the world to this day. It's just impossible to quantify the amount of good the Catholic Church still does. In the same way, there's this unforgivable evil that's also at work here. But you grapple with both sides of that. But in the United States, 13% of all Americans call themselves lapsed Catholics. The Catholicism is losing adherents faster than any other religion. For every 6 people that leave the Catholic Church, only 1 person joins the church. You've called the Irish Catholic Church, as you said, it's in a state of collapse. And you've also said that looking back at the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church, the real comparable might be the selling of indulgences, which gave way to the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago. So I guess I just want, you are also an historian of the church. How is that fair to say that, among the crises in the history of the church, maybe only the Protestant Reformation, the time of the Protestant Reformation and selling of indulgences is comparable to this? Where does this crisis fit in terms of seriousness?
Well, it's a moral failure of Roman Catholicism. It's, in my lifetime, there was another moral failure of Roman Catholicism that I would compare it to, and that's the Holocaust. Not the Protestant Reformation, although the Protestant Reformation, we remember, generated more than a century, almost 2 centuries of religious wars all across Europe, in which millions of people died, being killed by other people in the name of God. But something in the DNA of Christianity, this is bigger than the Catholic Church, from the very beginning of the Christian movement, really, or almost the beginning, scapegoated the Jewish people. The church defined itself positively against what you could call the synagogue, negatively. And it defined that bipolarity in such a way that there was a kind of theology of anti-Judaism put into the structure of the imagination of Christianity. That anti-Judaism, down through the centuries, morphed into racial anti-Semitism, which was ignited in a fresh way during the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, at the mercy of it and advancing it in Germany in a particular way, so that when the demonic character of Adolf Hitler comes on the scene, there is this ground of murderous corruption waiting for him to sow his seeds in it. And he does. I'm not saying that the Holocaust was caused by Christianity, but lethal Nazi anti-Semitism could not have done what it did or been what it was if it didn't come out of religious anti-Judaism. The Holocaust has its roots in this long Christian tradition. That is the largest Christian failure in history. And the Holocaust laid that bare in a very powerful way, which led the Christian churches and the Catholic Church in particular to reckon with this corruption, anti-Judaism as the source of anti-Semitism. And the church said no to its own history of anti-Judaism. The church, Mark, in the Second Vatican Council, way before you were born, 1962 to 1965, renounced the single largest cause of this tradition, the Christ killer myth, the idea that the Jews murdered Jesus, the Son of God. When the church renounced that myth, which was generated by the Gospels themselves, the most significant change in Christian history took place. The abuse of children by clergy is not an equivalent evil to the Holocaust. There is a way in which the Holocaust must be understood apart. But the abuse by clergy of children and the protection of the predators by bishops is an evil that is laying bare, in a similar way, something basic in Christian attitudes and theology. Right. Where does that leave a believer? I teasingly said to you not long ago, before we chatted on formally, that I've been trying to lapse my whole life as a Catholic. I think that people who've left the Catholic Church are, in a way, prophets, basically lifting up a kind of truth about the Catholic Church. And I actually honor that prophecy. But for me, when I say the truth at the heart of the lie, that captures the essence of the church for me, which is it is both sinful and good.
Right.
And that paradox is the heart of the faith. for
Right.
me. And the truth is, I feel at home in the church because I'm old enough to have faced again and again the way in which I myself carry that paradox in my soul, goodness and wickedness together.
Yeah.
So it's a long story, and it's a tragic story. But let me just end this little bubble of talk by getting back to the point you started with. The Catholic Church is more than 1 billion people. It's not the hierarchy in Rome. It isn't the Pope and the bishops. It isn't the Vatican museums. It isn't the churches. It's 1 billion people. James Joyce famously wrote in Finnegan's Wake about the Catholics. Here comes everybody. It's the only institution in the world that crosses every boundary, north and south, rich and poor, illiterate, uneducated, highly sophisticated, the most brilliant people. It is a snapshot of the human species. And the fate of the church matters enormously. We're living in a time when the human species is tempted to suicide, whether through weapons of mass destruction or through climate degradation. Will the human species have come all this way to commit suicide?
Right.
That question is before us. The Catholic Church can be a part of an answer to that question. It can be a source of the choice of life, of hope, of service over power, of truth over falsehood. The Catholic Church can be all of that, which is why it's worth fighting for. And finally, I would just remember all those people on the ground, nurses, teachers, missionaries doing work among the poorest of the poor with no strings attached, all over the globe, hundreds of thousands, millions of them. And they're the church I am trying to be faithful to, not the bishops in Rome.
Right. So James, I want to go through a few more questions. We're going to have a time for some audience questions at the end, but I just want to get through a few more questions of my own. Maybe just briefly, if you, I don't know if you can answer this next question briefly, but you speak very eloquently in the book and very powerfully about the figure that Pope Francis is, and unquestionably he's a kind of moral giant in the world today, and yet he has this tragic blind spot, which you describe at one point as being a blind spot that you yourself once had. But I guess there's a lot of questions I'd like to ask you about, but the one I want to ask you most is, if you were given 30 minutes with Pope Francis to have a meeting with him and just speak your mind, what would you say to him? And also, what would you try to ask him to do?
I would talk about the place of women in the Catholic Church. That's the pressing issue. The same way in which the place of women in culture is a pressing issue in the United States, in Europe. In the United States, we have two pressing issues: male supremacy and white supremacy. The Catholic Church's pressing issue right now is male supremacy. I would actually ask the Pope to think again about his basic commitment to justice, which is so obvious and so true. And how can he defend what's a clear structure of injustice? A commitment to assert the inferiority of women, half the human species. And the Catholic Church's commitment to male supremacy, which is blatant, is part of what has women at risk all over the planet. Women are being abused. Women are being enslaved. Women are being trafficked. Women are being caught up again and again in every culture, including the most privileged. Look at not a week goes by that we haven't some other way of being forced to reckon with the unjust treatment of women. Women having carried most of the weight of the COVID crisis. Women being forced out of the workforce because of their still unequal responsibility for the home. Pope Francis is a man who has a clear sense of justice. I would put before him this grotesque injustice that he's a defender of, the inferiority of women.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question about the reforms that you'd like to see taking place. I mean, that certainly would be among them. I guess something that struck me during the book is you talk about in this interview, you've said, you're trying to be a lapsed Catholic, but you just kind of, you remain a Catholic nonetheless. And I guess when I hear about all these reforms, tell me what is, I saw a rebuttal that a priest made to the Atlantic article. And sort of the gist of one of his points was, well, if you take away the priesthood or to deeply, disempower it in this way, you're sort of making the Catholic Church not Catholic anymore. It's sort of like, that's like one of the main features of the Catholic Church. And so I guess what I want to hear you say is, what is inherently Catholic that you are trying to preserve, which is not the priesthood? Therefore, you can dismantle the priesthood, yet it remains the Catholic Church for this reason.
Well, bread and wine at the table. Bread and wine at the table. The Jesus movement, which was not the Catholic Church, Jesus and his friends, and then Jesus dies and is gone, and his friends gather in his memory. They can't let go of their affection for him. That's how they're first defined. People who could not let go of their affection for Jesus, they gather to try to understand who he was to them. And what they find themselves doing with each other is what they had done with him, which is eat bread and drink wine, the fellowship of the meal, which comes down through the centuries into the liturgy of the Mass, which is still the bread and the wine. But that's the basic heart of the movement, Mark, going all the way back.
Right.
Well, if you think historically, the first 2 centuries of the church, Christians, Jesus people, gathered around tables at homes, which is one of the things that makes it ridiculous to say women can't be leaders of this movement, because women, even then, were in charge of the home. So it's easy to imagine that women presided at those gatherings of bread and wine. The Roman Empire takes over the Catholic Church in the 4th century. So several hundred years after Jesus, for several hundred years, the church is the home, the table. The empire takes over the church, and suddenly the emperor's palace becomes the church, the building. What was the emperor's palace? It was called the basilica. The word basilica comes from the herb basil, because the symbol of the emperor was the wreath he wore on his head, which was made out of basil. Most Catholic churches have the form of the basilica. When we go into it, so the priest who was complaining in response to what I wrote, saying, if Carroll gets his way, the church won't be Catholic anymore. It will be Catholic. It just won't be Roman imperial anymore.
Right.
It won't be the Roman Empire anymore. And furthermore, it won't be the Middle Ages anymore, and the monarchical structure of power that the church adopted in the Middle Ages. Maybe the church will adopt structures of liberal democracy. If the church could adopt structures of the Roman Empire and then structures of the Middle Age monarchy, why can't the church adopt structures of liberal democracy in our era? What's the opposite of patriarchy? It's not matriarchy, it's democracy.
Right.
And I am calling for a democratic church. And the priest who criticized me is right. It won't look like the Catholic Church that he knows and loves. And even if he's a good fellow and liberal, let's assume he is, he's still empowered in this clerical structure.
Right.
And when he doesn't want to lose the Catholic Church we all know and love, he may not want to lose his place in that structure.
Right.
What I'm talking about is a completely different structural organization but it's the same basic reality. Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among you. And that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's very moving to hear you speak like that, and you make a great point in the book that the Jesus movement before it was sort of co-opted by the Roman Empire had a very different kind of structure, and it certainly wasn't always this way, that priests had to be celibate and had to be men and so on and so forth. And you make this point that, like, if the Jesus movement could be influenced by the Roman Empire's practices at that time, why can't it now be influenced by the dominant mode of government, which is liberal democracy? I mean, I thought that was just a very interesting point. Just one more quick question from me, then we got a couple audience questions. So I'm going to roll all these questions into one here and just do your best to give me an answer. I'm curious about how you perceive this. Is it a movement? And the reason, what I want to say is, one of the points you make in the book is that there needs to be one way that change can really be incited is if there's a groundswell kind of from the people and from the clergy itself. And you point out how Cardinal Law here in Boston, was disgraced and exposed, and he resisted. And then all these priests wrote this letter. And the moment they wrote this letter, he was gone. He just resigned. They asked him to resign, and he did resign. And you suggest that there could be a mechanism like that here. But I guess to put it all on a point, my question to you is, A, is this a movement? B, are you the leader of that movement? And C, if you're not the leader of that movement, is there somebody who's a leader of this movement?
Well, it's a grassroots movement, so leadership is a marginal question to it. And the movement is powerful. The Catholic Church is in a state of collapse right now. The structures are in a state of collapse. Young people are not going into the priesthood. Young women are not going into the convent in nearly the numbers they once did. In nearly the numbers needed to sustain this structure. It's not happening. Money is drying up. It's a slow motion collapse, but it's nevertheless collapsing. But what I'm calling for is an overt embrace of political awareness in the church. There's a habit in Christianity and in Catholicism to think of the spiritual reality as not political. It is political. It's subtly political right now, and the bishops and priests control the political levers of power. Catholic lay people and priests, I would argue, need to think politically about how to change this system and this structure. By political, I mean getting together, community organizing, the basic structures of political activism. When the priest abuse scandal first broke in Boston in the early 2000s, there was a spontaneous gathering of Catholic lay people, a political action called Voice of the Faithful, that gathered thousands and thousands of lay people all over the Catholic world, especially the United States, that was very powerful for a moment. The same way that group of Catholic priests in Boston organized themselves politically to call for the resignation of Cardinal Law, which forced Law's resignation when the Vatican was still supporting him. Alas, perhaps because of reasons we were discussing earlier, the difficulty of sustaining the anger and the determination to change, those political movements dissipated. They can be recaptured.
Right.
And I would call on priests in particular, Catholic priests, who know more about the corruptions of this structure than anybody. Mm-hmm. And many of them know that their brothers are being broken by it. And many of them know that they're choosing to protect those predator brothers because of the structure that they're all caught in. Right. They know this. And if 50 priests in the Archdiocese of Boston today issued a statement saying no more business as usual, we will protest in these ways, A, B, C, and D. Mm-hmm. Change would follow. If several hundred or a few thousand Catholic lay people issued a statement together saying no more donations, we're going to boycott church every third Sunday and stand out in front of the church, and we'll have hundreds, thousands of people doing it, change would follow. Right. Priests organized nationally and globally. I mean, we have to think politically as Catholics, and it's happening at the grassroots, and soon it will become more and more visible. I'm sure of it. And those of you who have, quote, left the church are part of this movement, Mark,
Yeah.
whether you want to be or not. Just by having stopped identifying as a Catholic, you've sent a very powerful message. That is a statement, and it's coming from the grassroots. And as you referred to them before, the second largest denominational group in the United States, the first largest being Catholics, the second largest is former Catholics.
Right.
And that's powerful too.
Right. All right. Thank you, James. So we have a bunch of questions. We've only got about 6 minutes left before we have to wrap up. So why don't we just put a question or two up there? So this is from Bob Shea. Jim, how is it that you continue to describe yourself as a believing Catholic?
I believe in Jesus Christ and in the tradition that keeps alive his memory. That's the Christian movement generally. Mm-hmm. My experience of it as a Catholic is a core part of my identity. So it comes naturally to me because I am still in the grip of Jesus Christ, whose witness of service over power, whose belief in the power, the efficacy of love, who gives me a way of being in touch with the transcendent Holy One, who is unavailable to me otherwise. And the church is the way in which I have a living connection with this great figure. And that's why I'm determined to protect my identity. And finally, I refuse to let predator priests and criminal bishops rip this identity away from me. I'd rather stay and resist them. I'm a conscientious objector in the church, but I'm in the church.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. How about another question? Okay. Is Pope Francis the idealist even capable of introducing any changes into the money-driven system? Recent events in Poland prove the contrary. So without explaining the recent events in Poland, maybe a 1-2 minute answer.
Well, Pope Francis is capable of introducing the changes that I'm calling for. It would be a simple matter for him. I don't want to go too far into the weeds of this, but there's a tradition in the Catholic Church called the diaconate, deacons. It's a form of holy orders. It's akin to the priesthood. Deacons are already in the church, and they're married people. They're married men. Pope Francis could issue an order tomorrow saying, married deacons can do everything a priest does. Boom, you've changed the priesthood. He could issue an order tomorrow saying, women can be deacons. Boom, he's changed the priesthood. And both of those orders would be coming out of the tradition. They wouldn't be so radical. He'd be moving forward on a tradition, the diaconate, that already exists in the church. So yes, Pope Francis could do major things. He could take even smaller steps along that line that would set in motion this movement of change. But he's the Pope. You know, in the beginning of his pontificate, he famously said, "Who am I to judge?" And his critics said, "Who are you to judge? You're the Pope." You know, and if you can't do it, who can? And but it doesn't look like Pope Francis is going to do that, and who knows? But he still could.
Okay. Great. All right. So we have to wrap here. But James, I have one question left that I always ask of all the authors that come on the show, which is just imagine for a moment the ideal reader for this book, whoever you had in mind, who you wanted to receive this message and who in fact did receive the message in just the way that you had hoped. Imagine they get to the end of this book. Describe in a word or a phrase the feeling that you're going to leave them with this book.
A sense of connection to the transcendent that is beyond language. Language falls short of our expressing what matters most to us, which is what's just beyond the horizon, however you talk about it. And religion is one way to talk about it. Music is another. art is another, literature is another, but religion is a powerful way of talking about what's just beyond the horizon. My hope is that someone reading this book, whether they're Catholic or not, if they're Catholic or former Catholic or care about the Catholic Church, they'll have their own experience of it. But beyond that, my strongest wish is that people find language in my work for what has previously been unexpressed or inexpressible. My hero Thomas Merton titled a book "Raids on the Unspeakable." I'd like my work to be a raid on the unspeakable, on the unspoken.
Thank you, James. Thank you. I would agree. So folks, the book is called The Truth at the Heart of the Lie. It is a very beautiful book. It is just incredibly well written, incredibly poetic, incredibly moving. And James, ahead of the interview, you had said that you thought of it as a sad book. And I'm so glad you ended the interview the way you did, because there is such great beauty in the faith that you have and in your relationship to the church, even with all this tragedy. And in many ways, it is, as I said, just a strikingly beautiful book as well.
Mark, you are the perfect conversation partner for me in this subject. Your respect and your sensitivity is a gift. Thank you very much.
Thank you for saying that, James. Folks, we'll be back on The Thoughtful Bro a week from today with Pete Davis about his book, Dedicated. And we'll see you then. James Carroll, thanks very much for coming on.
Peace.